Okay, good afternoon everyone. You're listening to Talking Jobs with me, Dr. Rachel Bromnick, and today's recording is another in part of our series when we're looking to help students prepare for interviews. You may be doing your undergraduate or your postgraduate, and we're going to be giving some tips today specifically for those of you going for psychology interviews. So the points being made today, they're going to be relevant whether you're thinking of clinical or forensic, educational, occupational, any of those BPS routes. You might be looking for get some experience as an applied psychologist or applying for one of the postgraduate training. Now, most of you, I think, you will know some information already. So you probably know that only a minority of psychology graduates actually go on to become chartered. And in this series of Talking Jobs, we're giving you some ideas about what other people will do with their degree. I think you probably know that it's very competitive and you probably face quite a long road ahead. You further study, get an experience, and I think you probably know that you need to have like a tip-top CV. So you have a really good academic profile, but also that you've shown commitment to your chosen pathway, maybe through paid work or volunteering or extracurricular research and so forth. But this is something I don't think you might yet know, is that when you come to meet an employer, some of the feedback I get from course leaders and recruiters is that they can be a little disappointed or a little bit maybe frustrated when they meet psychology graduates. A bit like going on a date, actually, when you look at someone on paper and you think, God, they're going to be fantastic, and then you meet them and you think, oh, it's just not worked out as well as it could have done. So I'm going to help you today. In a short moment, I'm going to introduce you to a special guest who will help give some tips and ideas about how you can bring your psychology degree to life and perform well in psychology interviews. So stay tuned and we'll give you those tips. Okay everyone, I'm delighted to welcome today into the studio Dr. Aidan Hart. Welcome, Aidan.
Hi Rachel.
So
good to be here.
Yeah, good. So some of our students at University of Lincoln might know you, some might not. So why don't we just start and tell us a little bit about your own background and experiences.
Okay, yeah. So Rachel, my background is I am a practicing psychologist. I'm a chartered and registered clinical psychologist and forensic psychologist. I've been at the University of Lincoln since I think 2008, initially on secondment from the NHS, working on the doctoral training programme in clinical psychology. I've moved over to the master's degree in forensic psychology and the undergraduate programme, where I teach risk assessment, cognitive behavioural therapy and conditioning theory.
Great, thank you. Very well experienced. So, Aidan, I said in the introduction that when people interview psychology students, they're a little bit disappointed sometimes. So let's just hear from you. I've brought you in today because I know that you've interviewed lots of psychology students. So would you be one of those recruiters who are a little bit disappointed when you meet people?
Yes, I was trying to think of a better word than disappointed, but I can't think of one. Right. So I'll go with...
Is disappointed too strong or too light?
Bit from column A, bit from column B.
All right.
Okay. Depends on the context.
Well, let's hear some of your experiences that have led to this sort of point.
Mm-hmm. So this isn't a point that applies solely to students from the University of Lincoln. Some of the best students I've interviewed would be Lincoln students. But through interviewing people for the master's degree in forensic psychology, previous to that for the doctorate in clinical psychology, and I've also interviewed for assistant psychologists when I still worked in the NHS. This is a general theme that I think goes across how applicants often present themselves and talk about their level of knowledge in an interview itself. So one of the things that comes across quite disappointingly, I think, if you're on a panel, is when an applicant struggles to describe and talk about basic psychological theory.
Right. So what sort of question would you ask to try to tap into their knowledge?
So a question might be various things like, who do you think is the most important psychologist of the last 100 years? What's the most important theory of the last 100 years? What is your favourite psychological theory from your undergraduate degree?
And is there no right answer to that?
There's no right answer. There's no right answer to this, and there's usually an add-on to that, which is why.
Okay.
Yeah, and there's no right answer to this. Anyone who knows me at the University of Lincoln will know that I am a dyed-in-the-wool, colours to the mast, flag-flying behaviourist. Skinnerian mainly, obviously Pavlovian as well. And the thing to do is to not try to impress me by talking about behaviourism if you don't think that's important, because the question isn't guess what my favourite theory is and impress me with your knowledge of it. The question is purely, what do you think is important? What do you think is influential? What really grabbed your attention and passion?
And why do you ask that? Are you looking to assess their sort of genuine commitment to psychology?
There's a bit of sort of commitment to psychology, I suppose, because quite often in personal statements on applications, people tell me how much they love psychology and how much they've loved psychology since they were at school, forever, and they did a GCSE and A-levels and an undergraduate degree. So when somebody comes to me for an interview, having quite likely done A-level psychology, they're then in their 5th year. If they're applying in their 3rd year, they're in their 5th year of studying psychology, where they will have studied psychology for 5 years, the bare minimum 3 years. I want to know that as well, that they've been paying attention. I want to know that there is something about psychology that they like, that there is something that they can take away from their studies that will help them in their job, that they can then apply to the setting that they're going to work in.
Right, so you might ask them their favourite theory or who's most influential. And the reason we're here today is because people often struggle, don't they, to generate a really good or professional response to that.
Quite often they do. It is surprising. It's one of the most surprising, and not in a good way, things about the answers to that question, which is quite often people struggle. People's default position quite often is to go back to A-level and talk about Bandura and social learning theory. And Bandura and social learning theory is a fine theory. It's a fine theory to talk about. But people do struggle. Right. People mention Bandura and they may struggle to mention social learning theory, or they'll talk about the Bobo dolls and they will struggle to talk about and explain what the Bobo dolls experiment was, okay, and why it's important. And one of the things I always do with that type of question, which is basically just pick a psychological theory and tell me about it, is I then ask them to apply it to a real world situation. I might give them one, or I might just say to them, how could you use that theory in real life? Give me an example of where that theory can be or has been applied in society.
Good questions. Yeah.
Because one of the things we're interested in is, can you take your basic psychological theory and those sort of, I don't mean basic as in simple, I suppose. No. There's a very technical. Fundamental. Those are technical terms. We have basic, which is experimental, research based, applied. And applied psychology is the application of theory. It's the application of empirically valid psychological theory, evidence-based psychological theory, and you can't apply it if you don't know it.
And I think I said at the start, these points would apply to occupational or educational or any of those settings where you're looking at issues or case studies or trying to design solutions in those kind of contexts. Some people would call this psychological literacy, where you can use your knowledge to answer questions.
Yeah, I like that term. I think that is what we're trying to tap into with those types of questions. That's what I'm trying to tap into when I set those sorts of questions, is psychological literacy. Yes.
So we've identified the problem, Aidan. In one of my other recordings, I've done a recording with Lynn Wakefield from the Careers Service, and we've talked there about some general points about succeeding at interviews, including the need or the advice to prepare well. So our listeners can enjoy that recording as well. So we've identified the problem that people struggle with their psychological literacy or struggle to articulate their knowledge. Do you have some kind of tips and advice for people preparing for these sorts of quite high-pressured sort of recruitment events?
Yes, so I would say be prepared and expectant that you will be asked those sorts of things. That's one of the other surprises, is that
people are surprised.
People are surprised that when they come to an interview for something to do with psychology, that I ask them about psychology. I ask them about their knowledge of the thing that they're applying for. So be prepared. Be prepared to talk about psychological theory. Think in advance. I might be asked to talk about psychological theories, and get in touch with whatever your favourite one was, and think about why did I like this one? Why did I like Freud rather than Skinner? Why did I like Pavlov rather than Bandura? And just sort of
it's those critical thinking skills that people will have developed in their essays, won't they?
Yeah, absolutely, critical thinking skills. So as an example, I'm not psychodynamic at all. I don't use it. It's not a theory that I would teach. It's not a theory that informs my clinical practice, but it's absolutely fine for somebody to talk about that theory. I know that theory enough to deal with it in an interview, and the question is, as I said before, tell me about your favourite theory. And if someone can explain well a theory, even one I disagree with, or one that I wouldn't use myself to a high degree, and then say, I think this is important for these reasons, and I think it could be used in this way. The job is to demonstrate the knowledge.
So how it can be used and applied. And
it's
things.
not to absolutely. Yeah.
What I would say to people as well, I don't know if you would agree, is quite often people are volunteering or they're just moving through life or looking at the world, and I would say to people, make some notes in your role, because it's not often that you'll have a role as a psychologist, but you may be working as a care assistant or volunteering for a charity. And I would say, if something happens or something grabs your attention, make a note of it, and then afterwards see if you can think, is there any psychological theories I could apply that would account for why that happened. It might not be something clinical. It may be, let's say, there's a breakdown in communication with the manager and the workers or something. And, have a think afterwards. Was there any theory that would have predicted this could have happened?
Yeah.
And was there any theory that would explain? It might even be about explaining your own reaction to it, to something like that. And you'll start to build up that kind of literacy, the way of looking at the world in a psychological way.
I am so glad you said that, because yes, I totally agree, Rachel. I totally agree, and that neatly leads me in to a couple of other things that I could say. So quite often you're right. So when people come to apply, particularly for clinical, they may not have had experience as an assistant psychologist, and you don't really need it. And I think you've had a podcast.
Yeah, Dave's talked about that, and
Dave's talked about that. So a whole variety of roles count, as they would for, I think, all the postgraduate training routes. And one of the things that we're really interested in is people's ability to reflect on those experiences, and that also counts when you're writing about them on your application form in your personal statement. What we don't want to see in the personal statements, or when asked about it in interview, is a shopping list of experience.
Like, tick, I've done this, I've done that.
And it's a mistake. It's a mistake I used to make in applications and interviews, and was pointed out to me when I was getting feedback from or advice from other psychologists about my own interview style and application form style. So what we're interested in is what you've just suggested. It's people's ability to interpret and make sense of their job using psychology. So if you talk about a particular experience in an interview for a assistant psychologist job or a trainee clinical psychologist, then be prepared to be asked a follow-up question about what psychological theory can you use to make sense of what happened. So if people are talking about a difficult situation at work with a co-worker or a client or a patient on an inpatient ward, then be prepared to interpret that within a psychological framework. So I think your advice of just keeping notes or making notes about what's going on and trying to see can that be made sense of in psychological terms is really, really good advice, as is your advice about, well, if it's something connected to them and how they felt, because that is something as well that we're interested in. And it's probably less relevant to something like the forensic psychology interview, which is for the academic component for a course. But if you go for a job interview as an assistant psychologist or a trainee clinical psychologist, be expected to answer those types of questions.
About yourself and your reactions and things.
Not just about, about whether you can reflect.
All right,
so we are less interested in what you did. If you're coming to an interview with me, I don't just want that tick box shopping list in the interview. I'm less interested in what you did. I know what you did because you listed all the jobs that you've listed all the jobs that you've had. I know what you did. I'm less interested in what you did and more interested in what you took away from it.
And what it meant. Yeah.
And what it meant, yeah. So in what way are you different now, having done that job that that wasn't there before the job? I'm looking for that ability to self-reflect, and quite often self-reflect within a psychological framework. And we're not looking for really complex, complex analysis. It is a case of, look, this is what happened, and this thing that happened at work with this patient or this client seemed a bit confusing, and then I thought about it, or it just reminded me of this theory and this bit I'd learned from this module, and this is how I made sense of it.
Brilliant. Okay, well, that's brilliant advice, Aidan. Do you have any sort of final comments just for people going for interview or taking themselves down those routes to training? Any final comments?
Just read beforehand.
Prepare.
Be prepared. The other thing we haven't covered that you should be expected to be asked about is research methods. Yeah,
so gem up on those as well.
Gem up on research methods. It's a good chance you'll be presented with a problem and asked how you would solve that problem through research, how you would design a research project to investigate that problem. My top tip for a question like that, first words out of your mouth when you're asked, how would you design a research project to answer X? Always first words out of your mouth in your answer should be literature review. That's my top.
Right.
That's my top tip for
I mean,
questions like that.
I mentioned to you about the recording with the careers service, and they use the STAR approach for answering questions, where you start the situation. And I think what you said there about the literature review for research methods question is that's starting at the beginning, isn't it? You talk about a problem in the way that you'd write up your studies or approach that. And
I think people quite often or seem afraid, they forget, or it seems too obvious, or they don't really know what, so they don't know, they probably think they shouldn't say it, or it just seems too obvious to say, but it is how all of us start any research project. And it's the same with clinical work. If you're given a problem about how would you treat this patient with this problem, literature review.
See what other people have done first.
See what other people have done, see what the current state of the evidence is. So my top tips would be just prepare, read up and get yourself knowledgeable again on the psychological theories that you liked, enough that you could answer questions about why you like them and how they could be applied to the solving of real world problems. Read up on your research methods, and just think about the work that you've done and the experience that you've had, how that's helped you grow and develop as a person and as a budding psychologist, and ideally how you would make sense of your experiences within a psychological framework. It's that ability, the psychological literacy and the ability to self-reflect in a psychologically literate way is really what we're after. It's what I'm after when I interview people.
Oh, that's brilliant, Aidan. Thank you. I always want, when I've met someone like you, I always want to say thank you for the work that you've done. I don't know who I'm thanking you on behalf of, but I know
that's good. I'll take.
You've done some great work in the NHS and helping clients, and I know you do great work helping our students as well. So we're very lucky to have you.
Okay.
So thanks, Aidan. You've been listening to Talking Jobs with me, Rachel Bromnick, and our guest Aidan Hart. Just for time for us now to say goodbye. Bye. Don't say goodbye in a more enthusiastic way.
Bye.
Bye. All right. Thanks.